We chose the topic, I think, for two reasons, really. One is the industrial strategy is a signature policy of the current government, and it will be the basis on which billions of pounds of investment and government support is directed. But also, I think it's a fundamentally interesting topic at this juncture for the energy sector, which is, what is government's role in the energy sector? And I'd like us to focus quite heavily on the broader question of government's role. Now, I'm joined by four very distinguished members of the panel. So to introduce them briefly, although again in this audience I suspect none of them need any introduction. I'm firstly joined by Simone Rossi, who is the CEO of EDF Energy and has had a distinguished career in business. If you look through his CV, one thing that I think jumps out is that he, unlike most of us in the room, he may well have one of these as well, a degree in engineering or economics, but he has a degree in clarinet, which is not the first thing you would assume a CEO of a major utility would have, but he has one, and maybe if we have time we'll ask him how relevant the clarinet has been in his career so far, although I struggle to think of a way. Next we have Mike Lewis, who's the CEO of E.ON UK. I think interestingly at this juncture, he tells me he was the first employee and then later became the CEO of E.ON's renewables business. So clearly got out at the right time. And may well reflect on time leading E.ON's renewables business. We have Nina Skorupska, who is the Chief Executive of the Renewable Energy Association and has been since 2013. Before that, had several executive roles in the UK with RWE, among others. She has a CBE, which was granted in the Queen's Birthday Honours List in 2016. And for all you happy London commuters, she is on the board of Transport for London. So if you've got any grievances, you should feel free to have a chat later in the day with her. And finally, we have David Gray, who's the chairman of GEMA and has been since 2013. Will be retiring soon, which is often the best time to get a bureaucrat, a regulator or a bureaucrat or a politician on a panel, because they're more forthcoming with views than usual. So delighted that you're here. Unusually for a regulator, David was also the head of HSBC's Energy and Utilities Investment Banking team before going into regulation. So interesting qualification there. Before I jump into the panel, I'd just like to provide a few slides of context, and thank you to Mac for helping me pull these together. The first is the premise for the industrial strategy, and for panelists, if you squint, there's a screen down in the corner there as well. One of the key premises was government has a role to play in hitting our 2030 targets. You can see here, so far, carbon budgets have been successfully navigated, but more needs to be done. And if you look out 12 years, where the cross is, you see that on the current trajectory of existing policies, we're going to miss that 2030 carbon budget, and it only gets harder from there. So a key premise in the industrial strategy is more needs to be done. What does that more look like? Well, there are lots of things that it could look like, but one way of quantifying it is the sheer volume of terawatt hours that we need to generate power from need to add to the system over the next 12 years. So here we have the existing stock of zero carbon generation, about 160 terawatt hours, probably predominantly nuclear in the GB context. We've got known retirements and known additions essentially cancelling each other out in this period, which leaves about 80 terawatt hours of zero carbon generation that we need to add to get to that 2030 zero carbon production target and hit that budget. For people from the continent in the audience, my general rule in moving from GB to German system is I double everything. 300 terawatt hours to 650 terawatt hours or something like that is a fairly good translation factor. So in Germany it would be 160 terawatt hour target. Now the industrial strategy, although it was a strategic piece rather than a detailed piece, laid out some useful guidance in terms of where we should see action. One is clean growth. the report says we will maximise the advantages for UK industry from the global shift to clean growth. And second, in mobility, we will become a world leader in shaping the future of mobility as two areas where government is focusing. And then finally, and this slide is not intended to be read, it's intended to give you a sense of the volume of policies that are already out there in conjunction with the industrial strategy. It would be nice if the industrial strategy was being painted on a blank canvas, on a clean slate, but it's not. And this is some of the major policy initiatives that have happened in recent years. And these are not small points. You know, over on the left here in the blue is levy control framework, that thing that keeps us under £10 billion a year in expenditure on the power system. So these are all big policies, and indeed the red ones are all government interventions in the market that have happened since the publication of the industrial strategy. So this is not a panacea, it is one policy in the context of government's relatively deep engagement in the energy market. Okay, that's a good time, I think, a useful context to bring in our panellists. And Simone, I'd like to start. In fact, we may have a poll, actually, before we get into this. So if we could pull up the polling screen, and you should grab out Slido. Panelists are on Slido, so if there's not a better endorsement for Slido, then I don't know what it is. And the question is, all things considered, the state's role in the GB electricity market is, and there's too large, too small, and about right are your options. Okay, I don't know what a statistically significant sample size is in this room, but it feels like the best we're going to get is about 80. Now a few more. Good. Okay, and some good round numbers to stop on. So about half the room thinks it's too large. About 20% of the room think it's too small, and the rest, about 30%, think it's about right. Okay, so 50%. Too much, and 50% about right or too small, which is an interesting split. Of course, if you ask people, could government be smarter about their intervention, I suspect most of the room would say yes, because it's a tough job rather than anything else. Good, okay, so that's a good point at which to move to our panel, and, oh, there we go. And can I start with you, Simone? EDF is this kind of pin-up child of the industrial strategy, with, you know, lots of people employed, lots of things being developed. What do you see as EDF Energy's role in the industrial strategy?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I voted about right because I think Britain is really a successful case in attracting investment into its projects through frameworks. So in general terms, I think it's about right, generally. And then more specifically for the question that you are asking, EDF is also part of this. So what we are doing, we are commissioning in these days the Blythe wind offshore demonstration project. So EDF globally invests almost an equal amount of money each year into renewables as well as into new nuclear. These are two key technologies, and we also do a little bit of it here in the UK. So in these days, off the coast of the Northeast, we are also developing this project with the 80 megawatt turbines. But of course, we are also building a new nuclear station in Hinkley Point here in the UK. We now have about 3,500 people on site, of which 200 apprentices, and this number is growing. This year, we will be spending about £200 million per month on this project. And two-thirds of this money, around two-thirds of this money is spent in the country, and much of it actually locally. What do we intend to do? We intend to continue to invest in the country, and both in renewables and crucially also in new nuclear. We are now developing and hoping to bring to fruition a new nuclear project in Sizewell. We hope to do so on the premises that this project would be competitive to equivalent alternatives. That is a convoluted way to say cheaper than Hinkley Point. Hinkley Point is the first of a kind, so it comes with one-off costs and investments, and we do believe that the learning curve in this industry and the potential for replication of a next of a kind can deliver and will deliver indeed more affordable output, low carbon. And I would say that as we think about the future of the country, how to power the future of Britain, of course, we heard from Magnus and many other interventions that the recipe seems to be more electricity, and we know, you told us we need 80 terawatt-hour. So I think that this needs to come from a diverse set of sources, and there are no sources that are defect-free. They all have their own glitches and their advantages. And we intend to be part of it. The only thing that I would like to say is that we should be marrying the energy trilemma, so affordable, secure, low carbon, with industrial strategy as much as possible. And all else being equal, I think that we should probably make an explicit choice for projects that deliver the biggest impact on jobs and on the economy, which, and especially in regions in the country that may be needed the most. So this would be a way to marry those things.
Mm-hmm. And could I follow up on one of the points from earlier about the importance of scale in this industry? And nuclear, I think that's probably well known. Do you agree with Magnus and Alistair and the investment bankers advising Alistair that size is important in energy markets at the moment for non-nuclear projects?
Yes. In our renewable business, EDF runs this division called EDF Energie Nouvelle, which, by the way, I am using the same trick of Magnus, saying it's not official, but be aware that it's changing its name into EDF Renewables, big change, but we are changing from French to English, which is already something. Globally,
improvement.
It's in 21 countries, and we leverage a lot on the scale of this business to be able to deliver this type of project. So the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm. And so, Mike, could I bring you in on that? Because you're, and particularly with E.ON's new strategy, it appears you're doing very small things in a sense. You're in households, you're in factories. Can you explain a bit, firstly, I suppose, the role of doing those small things within the industrial strategy? And then I'd be really interested to hear about how a big company has comparative advantage in doing those things compared to a small company.
Well, I think the first thing to say is it's absolutely correct. Is we see in E.ON that the big challenge now, we've made huge success in renewables. You've heard all the statistics about how the cost has come down. I'll say more about that in a minute. But we think in many ways that is already done. We've got renewables, low carbon or zero carbon generation to a lower price than conventional generation. And now, obviously, there are a number of issues around intermittencies and so on that need to be solved. But fundamentally, we've solved the problem of decarbonising electricity production. Mm-hmm. What we now need to do, as has already been said this morning, is electrify transport and electrify heating. That's where the big challenge is now, and that's where E.ON wants to play a next key role, because we see it being at a similar situation as the renewables business was 10, 11, 12 years ago when I started, where, we talk about the success now, but it was far from a foregone conclusion it would be a success then. I remember looking at offshore wind 11 years ago, in 2008, 10 years ago. We had 2 projects under construction, both hugely over budget, hugely late. We had 2 projects in operation, one of which was out because a substation had had a fire in Denmark, another where all of the gearboxes were failing and the connection cable had failed. We had the London Array project under development. It came that close to not going ahead. And if the government had not moved in to increase the incentive to 2 ROCs, it wouldn't have gone ahead. And I think you can make a good case that if that had not happened, the rest of the success story wouldn't have happened. So I just want to make the point that it's not a foregone conclusion at the time, And this is why the relationship between the government and private sector is critical. We invested, when we were on the threshold of investing £800 million in the London Array, we wanted confidence that the government was standing behind us, and they did. And through that combination of long-term policy thinking and partnership, we delivered what I think it's fair to say is a world-class and a world-leading industry. So if I take those lessons and move them on to where we stand now in relation to making the energy transition happen downstream, what E.ON is trying to do is firstly make the existing system more efficient. So that means insulation in both homes and factories, energy efficiency measures for both homes and businesses, and things like boiler services, maintenance and repair to make them more efficient. So it's making the existing system more efficient. That's point one. Point two is enabling the future transition through smart. This means growing smart meters, and we've invested over 1 million smart meters now. There's a huge pressure on us to deliver it. We're ahead of the curve at the moment, but I think this is absolutely the key to opening up the future energy world. And along with smart meters, we're introducing smart tariffs, smart thermostats, so physical products that enable people to take advantage of that smart world. And finally, it's about the home of the future, the factory of the future. And this is about electrifying heating through things like heat pumps, electric vehicle charging points, which needs huge investment. And again, this is where a partnership with the government is absolutely critical. And why do I think we, as a large company, have an advantage? Because we can deploy expertise we develop centrally or in one market out to all of the markets. So we're rolling out smart meters in Germany, as well as in the UK, as well as in Sweden. We're looking at smart thermostats, PV and battery across all of those markets. And when you've got tens of millions of customers, you can take huge economies of scale in developing the intellectual property, developing the products, and deploying them at scale. Mm-hmm. So that's why we think it's a winning strategy, and will actually make a key contribution at the downstream level. As I said, we think that the upstream level, the problem is in a sense solved. It still needs huge investment. We believe our capabilities are better deployed where there's a problem still to be solved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Could I ask you on the London Array example, which I thought was striking, as sort of a government decision either way deciding whether an industry works. How do you get comfortable with the level of engagement you will need to have with government going forward? I mean, what if E.ON's heat pumps business is the London Array that goes the other way? You get the wrong minister at the wrong time. How do you manage that?
Yeah, clearly, it is a matter of constant engagement with government. And what we've seen, in many ways, is very supportive. The clean growth strategy is completely in tune with our view and with our energy manifesto that we published last year around about the time of the election. So I think fundamentally we're going in the right direction. And we have seen with the renewables policy, for 15 years, it was broadly consistent through Blair, through Brown, through Cameron 1. We had a very good understanding of what the government was trying to achieve, and indeed were able to influence it where we felt it was necessary. And that doesn't mean to say policy didn't change. It did change, but it didn't change suddenly. It didn't change in a way that devalued previous efforts and investment, and it changed in a way that made the whole system more efficient. And we got advance notification of that, and we're able to adapt. And it's a great example of where policy and equity risk capital working together can achieve really amazing things.
Okay, excellent. And we'll come back, hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about wholesale and retail markets more specifically. We can come back to government's continuity versus changes there. Nina, can I bring you in here? We've heard, in fact, all morning, one of the big themes has been renewables are the cheapest form of generation. They have a bright future. Do they have enough of a role in the industrial strategy? Do they need to have a role in the industrial strategy? Are you just going to get on and do what you need to do anyway based on market economics?
Well, let me just start by saying I think I've got probably one of the most fascinating jobs at this moment in time as Chief Executive of this trade association. In the last 4 years, so many things have changed, and our membership is one of them. We talk about the Big Six and the big role that they've done in igniting the inputs into renewables. But my membership's 550 member organisations, and majority of them are small to medium enterprise disruptors all believing their projects are going to be the viable solutions for a low-carbon future. The industrial strategy, the clean growth strategy itself, one of the 4 pillars, and I'll add the other 2 as well, one's artificial intelligence and also recognising ageing society along with mobility and clean growth, all I could say is when that document came out, it was about time. It was about time a framework came out. We'd seen hints of the direction of travel of working with both government and Ofgem, the regulator. We've seen the smart, flexible systems plan. So that was already beginning to recognise things were very different. It wasn't just a centralised picture. There was a recognition of technology, costs coming down, and the role of the home and the role of the business. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about that later. In the industrial strategy, you've got prospering from the energy revolution. It was a fantastic paragraph in there. But I'm a little bit fearful that we're waiting to have big demonstration projects again of things that are already being done around the world. In the Netherlands, in Germany, we'll have a city program, we'll have a community program. But actually, things are just happening. What do we need from the government now? This clear framework, an understanding of what the market can do to enable renewables as they come off subsidy, because they have. Solar, onshore wind are there. But what do we want to do to bring on the next wave of low carbon technologies? There are some other big technologies that make up renewable generation. That's not just solar and wind. We've got the what I would call now the resourced dispatchable renewables. So biomass, energy from waste, biogas, small, all now feeding in and hopefully tackling the heat system. I think what's missing is still the joining up of heat. And fortunately yesterday we saw the consultation come out from BEIS and the government asking for their views. It's not clear how it's going to go forward. Thinking everything's going to be electrified is an ambitious thought, and a lot of our members really buy into that. But that hill is really quite large to climb in order to think it's all going to be electrified. We have to be thinking. So as I go back to my role as the Chief Executive of the REA, looking at power, heat, transport, organic recycling and resources, all of those are going to have a role to play. And we need the government now just to create that right framework to make it happen.
And the regulators presumably as well have a big role to play in this incredibly complicated question. David, can I bring you in here at this point? And I suppose change gears a little bit from the industrial strategy, where Ofgem has I suppose less of a role in a sense, and BEIS is driving that forward. And just ask you broadly, in light of where the sector's going, what sort of role do you think Ofgem will play in the future relative to the role it's playing today as part of integrating renewables, as part of sector coupling between heat and electricity, and working out who pays for the grid, these types of questions?
Well, I think our role in terms of protecting the consumer and holding the ring in terms of the industry rules, etc., will continue in principle. But what that means in practice could change quite a lot. People have spoken already today about the changes in the industry, the pace of deployment of renewables, which has been really quite surprising and faster than forecast. We've seen a similar decline in the market share of coal, big changes in the way that energy is produced and put onto the networks. We've seen big changes in the retail market. We now have more than 60 suppliers to the domestic retail market, and that number is still rising. I'm probably out of date, frankly. And none of that will be the end of it. But interestingly, those small suppliers are still actually relatively conventional new entrants. They do more or less the same thing as the incumbent existing suppliers. I think what we'll begin to see increasingly is much more different things coming into the market, new ideas, new ways of dealing with customers. And we've got some insight into that over the last 15 months or so with a new service we opened at the beginning of last year called Innovation Link, which allows innovators to come to us for a simple one-shot, one-stop conversation about how the regulatory regime would affect whatever project they're trying to do. And that has been really interesting. We've had more than 150 approaches. The vast majority of them come from people outside of the conventional utility industry. And this, I think, is going to give us a real challenge. So in essence, I think the way we have to look at it is that we need to get into position to be regulating the industry we're going to have in 5 or 10 years, rather than the one we've had since privatization and until recently. I've talked about innovation. That's being driven by a number of things: the government policy on renewables, the arrival of digital technology, assisted by smart meters as they're deployed, etc. But in addition to all of those things that are happening, we've got the other 2 big challenges that have been mentioned. We've got electric vehicles and we've got decarbonisation of heat. And those are the other 2 big factors that will determine our role in the future. On the first, I think the simple announcement of a deadline of 2040 for no new diesel or petrol cars is really quite a big step for government. I think that will probably accelerate the deployment of electric vehicles quite substantially. And on heat, as people have said, the 2050 targets effectively require the full decarbonisation of heat. And there are a number of ways that that could be achieved. The government is thinking hard about and has now started on the process. But at the moment, it's not clear, and we need to make sure that we can react to events and have a system that's fit for purpose. So I think, just to put it in context, the 3 main things that we are working on and will continue to be working on then for the next few years are, first of all, how to remove barriers to innovative new ideas while maintaining the necessary degree of consumer protection. Secondly, making sure that the next set of price controls, RIIO-2, which we've already started working towards, allow and encourage the network companies to respond to the way that these changes are changing the use of their networks. And thirdly, we need to review the network access and charging arrangements to make sure that these are appropriate for the role we're moving into and don't put barriers in the place of things that they shouldn't be deterring, and do introduce a degree of fairness and reasonableness to the system. So I think we'll be doing the same things, but they could be taking us into quite new territory.
And I hope we can come back on the network access and charging arrangements. Could I just follow up on one point you made about suppliers and 60, maybe 70 now? I suppose one of your role, I suppose a simple question is, how many suppliers is the right number? And I don't expect you to be able to answer that, but I'd be interested to know. Certainly, I suspect after weather events in recent weeks, some smaller gas suppliers will be having a problem. But more broadly, how do you see Ofgem's role in encouraging smaller players to enter the retail market, increase competition?
I think with the current batch, the new suppliers that have already arrived, it's not obvious that we need to do more to encourage new entry. There's been a lot of new entry. And in fact, as you said, the questions are now rather more about how we handle potentially failures of new business models in that space. We have a mechanism for picking up the customers from a failed supply company and moving them to someone else. And it's been tried and it's worked. So it's quite a balanced picture there. I think the issue is more to do with the less conventional new entrants. And increasingly we find when we're talking to them that the problem they face is the requirement to be a licensed supplier in order to have any interaction with a customer. And it's not just the license, it's everything that connects you to in the form of the industry codes and so on. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to think hard about whether the new, more innovative business models really need to be subjected to that degree of licensing and industry code requirement, or whether something much simpler and much easier would be appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you didn't answer the question about how many is the optimal number of suppliers.
How long is a piece of
60?
string? I'm sorry, there is no answer to that.
I assumed you would. Can I ask you, no one's mentioned the price cap, and I'd like to just bring you in briefly on this to understand where we are on that, and then Mike, it would be useful to hear your thoughts on price cap and retail competition as well. So where are we on the implementation of the price cap, David? Is it on track? Where will we be and when?
We've started working on the questions of design of a price cap in parallel with the bill progressing through Parliament. We produced our first publication on this a couple of weeks ago, I think, and there'll be a series of them. There's a whole series of related issues we need to think about in terms of price cap design, and we need to get on with it quickly. And we expect to be in a position when the bill achieves royal assent to go ahead with implementation of a cap then. It does take a certain amount of time after the bill becomes law for it to be implemented, but we will do it in the quickest possible time to be ready for the end of the year, next winter.
Okay, very good. Now, I'd like to bring Mike in on that, but before we do, I think there's one more poll. So if I'm right, it should appear on the screen soon. There may not be, by the way. I'm going into my memory banks. Simone looks like he's... Okay, good. Which best... Okay, it's price cap related, so very good timing. Which best reflects your view on the retail price cap? Unnecessary, costly, additional regulation that should be scrapped. And you should choose the one... You don't necessarily have to agree with the whole statement, but pick the one that's closest to your view of the world. An appropriate temporary measure to enhance equity within the customers rather than within the suppliers. Sensible regulation to protect the most vulnerable. Hopefully it will remain in place permanently. And I'll stop when we get to, about now, I would say. Good. Okay, so the room is, compared to other poll results where we've had a fairly diverse view, the room is fairly against the cap. 18%, 13% thinks it's sensible regulation to protect the most vulnerable there. Good. Mike, can I bring you in? So just your thoughts. David's talked about innovative new business models in retail markets and other markets. How do you, I suppose a broad question is, you're entering you're doubling down on an industry that has a lot of competition. I agree, the German system and the British system are different in terms of energy supply. How do you compete in that world as a major supplier? And what does the price cap mean for business? Is it a sensible? How did you vote essentially?
Well, I voted number one. That should come as no surprise. I mean, we've made our position very clear that we don't believe a price cap is necessary or indeed sensible, because it will actually have a number of unintended consequences, all of which was pointed out by the CMA. Our view is very much, though, if there is to be a price cap, it should be based on a cost stack. It should be temporary. There should be very clear criteria for when it would be removed. And above all, it should leave enough headroom so that competition continues. I think that's the most important point. It's ironic that the government is talking about introducing a price cap when competition is more intense than it's ever been. Mm-hmm. We have more than 60 suppliers, as you've said, many different business models around that. 22% of the market is now with those new entrants, and we're seeing the rate of switching and changing to new entrants going up all the time. It was a record last year, and it was a record last month. So, in our view, that's exactly what competition is supposed to do, and if you now start to constrain the market, you will cause problems. We've also taken vulnerable customers out with the PPM price cap, the vulnerable price cap, and potential extension of it. So our view is it doesn't make sense. Nevertheless, those are the criteria, at least, by which we think it should be introduced. How do we compete? We've been very clear about this. We want to build it around the smart new world. That's why we've said we want to be ahead of the game in terms of installing smart meters, developing new tariffs based around smart, which we've already started to do, and giving consumers a range of choices not just of tariffs, but also of physical products like Tardo, the smart thermostat, and engaging with them each individually, which is why we've also announced we're proactively taking people off the standard variable tariff, offering them a new tariff. We'll put them onto a fixed term tariff price below the SVT if they don't actively choose, but what we'd like them to do is engage with the products we have available. So we talk to them and get them to actively choose rather than default onto a tariff. And that's how we believe we can succeed in a competitive environment. And indeed, with Smart, we believe we can do a lot more for them. And we know from our Net Promoter Score that once we've installed a smart meter, not only do they have a very good customer journey when we install the Smart, they are more active or more likely to actively promote the company when they have a smart meter. There's a number of issues around smart meter, SMETS 1, SMETS 2, but nevertheless, we believe that whole trend will be the way of unlocking better engagement and a better competitive positioning for ourselves.
Okay. I was just as a quick follow-up on that, is there a risk with smart meters that it would diminish competition? David, Mike, any
I don't see any reason why.
Okay.
No.
Okay. Good. I was interested, I was having a look around. It would be good to get a BEIS perspective on this in the room. We don't have anyone from BEIS on the panel, but Dan's got his hand up, which is good. Now, Dan's got a bigger role now at BEIS. He does networks and markets and security. And so this presumably falls under markets. How did, you don't have to answer this, how did you vote? And more broadly,
have a guess.
Not in the general election, in the polling. And what's your view on the price cap and its role within the energy system?
Well, I think it's probably worth just explaining why government felt it had to act here. And the CMA reports was very clear that consumers were suffering a significant detriment in this market. It's true, and to be welcomed, that there's been a lot of competition in that market and driving up the rate of switching and indeed the number of people with some of the newer suppliers. But that's led to a bit of an emergence of a two-tier market, one where there are those who get the benefits from that competition and others on high SVTs who do not. And the CMA panel split, frankly, about whether it should tolerate that detriment because competition would come good, or whether it was necessary to put in place a time-limited intervention to remove some of that detriment whilst competition developed. But I think the important point to take is it's not just about introducing a price cap, as important as that is and necessary as that is. It's also about those measures to make sure that competition comes through and that we have a vibrant market that doesn't need a price cap and that has the removed detriment through competition in due course.
And will there be clarity around conditions under which the cap will be removed, as Mike proposed?
So this was one of the points that was scrutinised by the Select Committee, and one of the difficulties with this is if you set down now exactly what the metrics are for what competition will look like in 5 years' time, with a market that's changing so much, with people who are competing across what are currently non-energy markets, bringing those offers together for consumers, you'll probably lock in a mode of competition that was the case in 2015, rather than enabling the new competition. So I think it's important that we leave that judgment in the first instance to the regulator, who will be advising government on whether or not it's necessary to extend the cap, and in the second instance to the government of the day.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you for jumping up. Okay, good. So we've talked about the industrial strategy. We've talked about retail. We could obviously go into more depth on all of them. I'd like to spend a little bit of time on the wholesale markets now. Simone, it would be good to bring you in. You mentioned at the start, one of your first points was GB is a great place internationally to deploy capital. And I know in your previous role, you were looking at deploying capital, I think, in lots of different geographies, and you had your choice to make. So I suppose the first part of the question is, what is it that makes GB such a great place to deploy capital? And I suppose linked to that, if I'm characterising your comments correctly, and I suppose linked to that, I'd be really interested in what is it that will drive the cost of nuclear down? Why is it that we're talking about £90 and now we're talking about potentially substantially lower from a cost reduction perspective?
Okay, two very different questions.
Well, they might be similar questions. You might be investing
you're right.
because you got £92.
Well, I think that why Britain is such a great place, I think is, we are in a place actually that is one of the reasons, and it's a combination of rule of law, open society. This is clearly a place that is much further ahead than many other countries, and the framework that different governments have been able to create over time is such that things are happening. And I think it's interesting. I was reading recent statistics that over the 26 years between 1990 and 2016, the British economy has grown by 2/3, and CO2 emissions have fallen by 45%. It's curious. Okay, one could argue that the starting point was not really great, but still looking internationally and globally, which countries have done so, you don't find that many. So I think it's really a very attractive place where to come. And now to the second question. Of course, it's linked to the first one, so why would EDF, for example, or a company think of further exposing itself to the country? It necessarily linked to the first question. But the second question, why do we believe that this nuclear can become cheaper? Well, I would say, forget cheap, it will remain expensive to build, that's for sure, because we think that the first element is replication and learnings. It's interesting to hear from Mike what the offshore wind industry was a few years back, and then many things happened and drove the costs down. Now, not all those things can happen in nuclear, because nuclear doesn't have the possibility to have bigger blades or other. They are already very big, so they can't get any bigger. It will remain the same size. But there is a benefit in learning from these new type of projects. And eliminating the risks into a next-of-a-kind power station. It is something that in France EDF has done a few times, very successfully, and we think it can be redone here precisely at Sizewell. The second thing is the cost of capital. That is to say that one of the big differences in nuclear is that there is not a long queue of investors asking to invest in new nuclear. That brings the cost of money up. And so when you apply this cost of money to a high upfront investment, it translates into, all else being equal, a higher cost per output. So I think in this sense, I think that a next-of-a-kind project like could be Sizewell could be a useful test case to see if we can evolve further the framework to enable this asset to be seen more like a quasi-regulated asset, if I may say so. And so capable of attracting third-party investments and thereby reducing the cost of capital. So if we can reduce the construction cost, and we believe we can do so to the extent of about 20%, and we also reduce the cost of capital, the two together can make it really competitive with equivalent alternatives.
And could I just have one quick follow-up on that? The other argument I often hear around new nuclear is the diversification, and we saw the gas potential shortages last or a couple of weeks ago. Does nuclear play a meaningful role in terms of diversification?
It does, very much so. I'd like to say that nuclear is not perfect. Sometimes power stations have unplanned outages, and sometimes these outages happen when you don't need them. For example, even in the beast from the east a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. Now we have the mini beast from this, so I'm getting confused, but the bigger one. We had all our nuclear stations online, but we had to reduce load at one of ours because we got so much wind. So wind was producing very well, and the seaweed were coming into the cooling system. We had to lower. So, we had interconnections. Sometimes interconnections work well. Sometimes interconnections, they work well to the extent that there is power on the other side of the interconnection. That is generally the case. Sometimes it's not the case. We also seen that. So I would say, for windy days, there is wind. For still days, there is maybe nuclear, or there are interconnections. I would say there's not a single solution. I would say it's really common sense. We need to put our eggs in different baskets, and only taking this diversity into consideration, we will probably have a more reliable, low carbon, and affordable system. and hopefully one also that can create jobs and support industry, industrial strength, and build GDP.
Nina, can I bring you in and give you the last word? We'll finish at 5 past and start lunch slightly late here. So on the local jobs point, we heard a theme going through this morning. Alistair talked about the social contract. Rachel talked about community energy and getting the community involved with generation and other parts of that. What is the role of, I mean, you know, at a sort of a cold sort of economic outlook is, well, energy should be, you know, generated, supplied by the most economically efficient actor in the market. What is the role of community, and maybe the community level is the right one, what's the role of community energy within the industrial strategy and just as within the wholesale markets?
Blimey, that's quite a question that covers everything. A few years ago, at the REA, we took a step back and we understood that there is an extraordinary role, and we saw the success of renewable generation from centralised assets delivering into the market. There was some kind of market mechanism, the levy control framework, the CFDs, and I mean, we talked on the phone about what do I think about the next range of contract for difference and the 3 pots and the fact that only 1 pot exists and the third one you might as well throw it away because it's never going to get funded. Pot 1's been stymied for onshore wind and solar, so where is this technology neutral, cost effective delivery of renewal? So there's my rant on the levy control framework. But
so we need bigger pots for renewables, or
well,
we need to actually
just get past the point of trying to pretend that there is a market that's equally based for all forms of renewables. The interventions and the rules and checks and balances that have happened in there have seen, you know, some advanced conversion technologies like gasification, which we need to see come on board, because potentially they could be part of the greening of the gas network, you know, making different forms of gases. But you asked me about the community side. Well, they were the real champions at the beginning of wanting to argue that making and using energy closer to home, unfortunately avoiding all the grids and the networks, could have been the way forward. The democratization of energy by people being interested in how that generation is created. But decentralized energy isn't just about communities. It's now about the smart cities, smart businesses. The thing that's kept solar alive over the last few years is power purchase agreements, and the fact that maybe now, because we're getting some of the regulations of co-location of energy storage with it, that we are seeing subsidy-free projects coming on board. In all of this, we need different ways of looking how to finance these different projects. And going back to the industrial strategy, the Green Finance Task Force, hopefully we'll hear soon before summer, will be coming up with different ideas of how we will fund these different projects. I mean, I'm looking forward to later we're hearing about peer-to-peer use of blockchain. I don't know exactly what it all means yet, but I'm determined to find out. So how do we enable those projects which will deliver the 2030 targets in a low carbon way happen across all scales in a decentralized way, in a centralized way, and making sure we have the right framework?
Yeah, interesting. And it's good, you know, David's point on letting different business models thrive and compete is clearly core to all of that.
It's true, but I also have to add, even though I'm an evangelist for new business models and new approaches, I mean, I used to run a big power station, but this is where we're at. Looking forward, we do still need to protect the consumer. We do still need to make sure everything we're doing in people's homes and in businesses are safe. So we need good standards, we need good qualities, and that's where the established industry have been really extraordinary on. So how do we marry this, you know, fantastic innovation and disruptive technologies with delivering a secure system? The industrial strategy, what I really liked about it was it finally got rid of one of the corners of the triangle. It no longer said it was a trilemma. I disagree. It said you can make it affordable and secure, and you can make money in a low carbon way. GDP will continue to grow. The jobs are growing in this sector.
Great. That's an excellent way to finish the panel. We've run 7 minutes over time. I always knew that was a possibility, and we didn't even touch on a lot of the areas that I had hoped we would. So first of all, can you please join me in thanking our panellists, Simone, Mike, Nina and David.